Hello and welcome to the Mendenhall Podcast. My name is Slade Mendenhall,
My name is Brian Underwood.
and today we're going to be discussing job numbers, whether Wall Street and Main Street are on the same page, the Obama administration's environmentalist agenda, and how all might be interrelated. This and more on today's Mendenhall Podcast. Okay, welcome. Today is Friday, the 8th of November, 2013, and it's been a day of pretty considerable economic news.
Yeah, we have new unemployment numbers out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Just north of 200,000, right?
Yes,
200 and
4,000.
204,000. So, I mean, on paper, that seems optimistic, right? That
Yeah,
seems, I mean, it seems positive, I should say. I don't want to say optimistic in the sense that, I'm challenging it or something,
yeah,
but I am.
yeah. Obviously,
Ultimately, we will
no,
be.
that yeah, it looks optimistic on paper until you start saying, well, the overall unemployment rate still ticked up 1 point this month, and then at the same time, the same statistics pointed
By point one,
point
a
one,
tenth of a point,
yeah,
just to be clear.
tenth of a point.
Yeah.
The Labor Department reported that 720,000 people dropped out of the workforce over the same time period. So, and according to that, that would
That's the lowest since 1978, just to be clear. So
62.8% of Americans are in the labor force. So 1 in 3 adult Americans are no longer in the
that
labor
is
force.
awful.
Yeah,
That is really awful. And interestingly, and I heard this morning on CNBC, Rick Santelli was saying that apparently, based on the current trajectory of the number of people, people holding jobs, people engaging in the labor force, seeking work, by whatever standard. So essentially, the labor force participation rate, broadly defined, based on the current trajectory within 4 years, assuming that it all stays the same, which unfortunately right now we have really no reason to believe otherwise. It's all
absolutely.
been pretty disappointing. But in 4 years' time, based on the current trajectory, you will have more Americans outside of the labor force than in it.
Absolutely, because current numbers aren't keeping up with the adult population growth. We we gained 204,000 jobs this month, but we gained 213,000 Americans in the adult labor force. So it's not keeping up with the current trends, and absolutely, in a number of years, it's just not going to be a sustainable trend.
Well, and you mentioned one interesting point that I want to return to, which is that you had a essentially you had mass departures from the labor force
Mm.
in the last month or so, 720,000, I believe it was. And so, the government defines the unemployment numbers, as people who are currently out of work but seeking work.
Absolutely.
So, what's interesting is that you had such a significant number of people depart from the labor force. So you had 720,000 people leave the labor force. That is to say, they were seeking employment and they are no longer seeking employment.
Yes.
And you had 204,000 people gained, or you produced
4,000
204,000
new jobs.
jobs.
Yes.
But as I understand, there's a discrepancy between the number of people who gained jobs and the number of jobs that were created.
Absolutely. As we've been, discussing during a break, we talked about how you might be gaining these jobs in the economy, but people are picking up second jobs. They're not going to people who are unemployed. They're people who need the second job to cover, day-to-day expenses. So you were gaining jobs in the economy, but that doesn't mean the economy is necessarily improving in any standard.
Right. In many cases, it just means that someone who already had a job is having to take on another job to make ends meet and so forth. But then, I mean, anytime you get into labor economics, anytime you get into job numbers and job reports, you're always having to really untangle a very tangled web of data and information and issues of how various, how unemployment is measured and the politics of that. Right now, it's important to bear in mind that although, yes, the current unemployment rate is what,
7, I believed it was 7.1, but I can check that.
okay, so
It was in the seven range.
right, we'll come back to that in a moment. It's important to remember that the actual percentage of Americans who are seeking work who remain without work is actually between 10 and 11%. So that's a significant discrepancy. That's a discrepancy of 4%. So I mean, you have a huge number of Americans who don't meet the government's definition of unemployed, but that extra 3 point something percent, which is what is the final number?
The 7.3%.
7.3%. So there is a discrepancy of 3% who are people who have simply given up.
Yeah,
People
absolutely.
who've altogether stopped looking. And there's a question. Again, Rick Santelli mentioned on CNBC this morning that there seems to be a caveat in all this between mass departures, again north of 700,000, but you still had a 1 point uptick in the unemployment rate as that's defined, and it's important to recognize why. And the reason comes down to government shutdown, comes down to furloughs, which furloughs are defined by unemployment, by unemployment statistics, by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, as essentially temporary layoffs.
Mm-hmm.
So government employees during this period who faced furloughs in their salaries and payment, are considered temporarily laid off.
Right.
And so that also factors into it. But I mean, none of this speaks well about the economy as a whole. None of this speaks well about the our overall well-being, but particularly it doesn't speak well of our economic policymakers of the Obama administration.
No, not at all. Because 5 years into the Obama administration's governance, we haven't really ever recovered the number of jobs he started with entering office. We're still
right. I believe, not to interrupt you, but I believe I heard today, and someone, please, I welcome anyone to check my numbers, but I believe that we would have to, as of right now, we would have to gain something like 2 million jobs to get back to where we were when Obama took office at the beginning of 2009.
Absolutely. And we've seen a number of economic programs fall through or be proposed by the Obama administration that haven't got the economy going, that have, at the very best, been temporary kickstarts. But you just have had sluggish economic growth or even stagnation for 5 years, and it just hasn't improved in any sense. I mean, we aren't necessarily as bad right as we were around the 2008 collapse, but when you think about where we should be, we should be recovered, we should be back on a normal track rate of what's normal for the United States. But 5 years with this administration, we just haven't seen that.
And I think there are interesting dynamics. There's always interesting dynamics when you look at the labor force, when you look at unemployment. But I think that it's particularly interesting when you think about the dynamics of sort of the life cycle of labor. And there's just something that occurred to me in the midst of you talking about that, is that when we talk about, for instance, young people having a very difficult time finding employment right now because the youth unemployment rate is considerably higher than the national unemployment rate, and it really speaks to the difficulty of recent graduates finding employment, something that
we're both familiar with.
We are both familiar with. Yeah, and coming up against very hard. The Mendenhall, incidentally, is soon to become a revenue-generating machine.
Yes, ideally, yes.
Yeah, totally unrelated though.
Yeah.
Totally unrelated issue. But that aside, I think it's interesting to think of the sort of life cycle of labor, which is to say that when what young people are really up against in many cases is that people at the upper echelons of the working force, people who have had salary raises and career advancement for years because of the hardships of this past recession, it's my understanding or my perception that people aren't retiring as quickly. People aren't leaving the labor force. They're staying in it longer. And so what that amounts to over time is that when they don't retire, those just under them, mid-level employees, middle management, so forth, they're not advancing.
Absolutely. And you have a issue where people aren't retiring, and even those who have job security, even those who have higher degrees, are able to move around from job to job, they didn't have that security, or throughout this economic recession and turndown, people haven't been able to keep their same jobs. I'll use my father as an example. He worked as an electrical engineer for the same company for decades, and company started going under, and he had to change jobs, take a wage decrease, but it was still a more secure job. But in the end, it threw off your economic plans. It throws off your savings plans. It throws off your retirement plans, just because the economy is not as stable as it should be.
Right, and and so when what you see in that sort of circumstance, when people at the upper level are having to, that they're not able to retire, they're maintaining, they're holding their jobs for longer, and or in many cases they're having to take on other jobs that they wouldn't. They're having to take on, lower paying jobs. In both instances, that sort of endures the economic prospects of those who might be somewhat younger or less experienced or a bit farther down the chain, because if those above them are not retiring, then they're not moving up into their places, and if those above them are moving down into lower paying positions, then they wind up competing with one another in a way that in a healthy economy you wouldn't normally see.
Yeah.
And so as a result, the chain effect, down and down the age spectrum and a spectrum of experience and salary and so forth, and responsibilities for that matter, because as people get older now, that naturally they have children and homes and
Yeah.
expenses that young people don't have and so forth. So the final effect of all of that is that young people entering the labor force now are having to compete with
Yeah.
people who have been in it for years.
Yeah, but you know what the left is going to say? They're going to say, well, that's only more reason to improve Social Security, so to speak, to reduce the retirement age or increase benefits and all these other things. So, what do you say to that?
Right,
Yeah,
naturally. Well, I mean, then you just wind up with even more bloating in an entitlement system that is already, it's already paying out to retired people more than they ever put into it. And so it's already, you're already past the peak point, of those systems.
mm,
Personally, I don't see any way that they can be maintained in the long term, say in the next 15 to 20 years, without having severe economic effects.
yeah,
And I'm concerned that if they do get bolstered as a way to alibi the left and cover up their other economic failures, then you face rising inflation.
absolutely. And this ties in a lot of ways to, the regulation of the financial industry, where people put their money, where they invest their money and expect to draw from it later. That industry is so heavily regulated. Like you look at 401ks, 403bs, those numbers, those letters and numbers are clauses in government statutes. The
Right.
government says what kind of programs, what kind of policies these investment agencies can offer. So there's a limited number of options when it comes to saving for retirement, for building up, and then eventually getting out of the labor force because you saved up enough. And these options are so limited that, especially in the economy as it is now, people aren't able to just get out of the labor force because they're being, many times, they're taxed twice on the same money. They're taxed on the front end with their investments in their 401ks, and then they're taxed on the back end drawing from their 401ks.
Oh, it can be worse than that, depending on the path of the money through the economy. Think of it this way: you have a company that, first of all, generates revenue and profits, and so they pay corporate taxes,
Mhm.
and then when they pay it onto their employees, you have income taxes.
Mhm.
If the employees have shares in the company, then if that's part of their pay structure, then they pay capital gains taxes.
Mhm.
And then once it actually comes down to finally gets to the employee, well, then in the course of, say if he saves it, he faces inflation, which is an indirect
Yeah.
sort of silent tax, silent killer. If he spends it, you face sales taxes.
Mm.
And if he doesn't spend it, he faces death taxes.
Yeah.
So forth. I think I lost count there, but I think that was about 7 or 8 different ways that this could be taxed
Yeah.
in the course of it simply passing from a corporation to the employee and him being able to use it
Yeah.
or not
Absolutely.
at his discretion. And I think you make an interesting point that there is with these, particularly with Social Security and with these entitlement programs, there is an unspoken, unmentioned, unaddressed consumption smoothing tendency of these programs. And it's not just a tendency, it's by design. It's what it does. That is to say that it takes money from you when you're younger and gives it back to you when you're older. And therefore, in a sense, it dictates to you the pattern of your spending over the course of your lifetime
Mm.
in such a way that, I mean, say you were a young person and you wanted to say, well, I'm young and I'm healthy and I can travel, I can do things, I can, I have the freedom, I don't have obligations right now. I don't, I'd like to do something different, maybe not just work a 9 to 5. Maybe I want to travel abroad, spend a year,
Start a new business,
start a new
invest.
business. Exactly. And essentially, what these programs do is put an adverse pressure on those impulses and say, no, let's be reasonable here. And they are fundamentally very, conservative sort of programs, not politically conservative,
Yeah.
but conservative in the sense that they want you to be very modest in your ambitions with
Mm.
such things, and they want to, make sure that over the course of your lifespan you maintain a very equal distribution of your wealth and your use of it,
Mm.
regardless of your desires for that. Because ultimately, despite the fact that it's your property, it's not at your discretion to be
Right.
used, is their operating premise. So
And we mentioned, just on the same topic, we mentioned the financial industry and some of the regulations they face. But at the same time, with all these unemployment numbers and all the statistics we're able to throw out, the Dow Jones reached a record high today, or not today, but this week. And even today, it went up a significant amount. So is this some sort of disconnect?
well, I think that's interesting because like you said, today it was up what 1.08 Dow Jones
To
and
15,761.
761. All right, 15,761. Now, if we remember that, I mean, I remember the day when it was a big deal in 2009, I believe, that the Dow, after the downturn, the Dow upticked above, I think, 9,000, and that was a triumphant day.
Yeah.
And naturally the economy has gotten significantly better, or by all appearances has gotten better since 2009.
Yeah.
However, this just doesn't feel to me like a 15,761 economy. And
No.
and and I know that I'm fully aware that financial indexes and the Dow are not always a direct a direct signifier of our overall economic well-being. But that's specifically my point. Is that I think that I mean listening to financial commentators today on the news, they all are just rosy with optimism about the economy. Just thinking that the biggest problem that the United States could have in the next year is that the markets are doing too well, and so the Fed might actually have to curtail bond yields and so forth to try to dampen just how well we're all doing. And that's just, I mean, to anyone who's not working in finance, I think that's absurd.
Yeah.
I think that, and I don't want this to come off wrong as some kind of tirade against the financial industry or anything like that. I just think that what we've seen, in the last couple of years with budget crises and so forth, and the sort of economic turmoils and economic and political turmoils we've had, has been, we've seen consistently that financial markets and the financial industry, they like certain conditions.
Yeah.
They like predictability.
Hmm.
They like consistency, and to me, their interests are rather short term by comparison to what's maybe in the best interest of the country at large. Because I think that they tend to.
Or let's clarify their interest in the long term as well.
Right.
Yeah.
In the long term, that's absolutely
Yeah.
right. Their interests as well as well.
Yeah.
But I think that the thinking that's at work there tends to favor a short term approach. That that's great if you're if you're in that industry and if you're in financials for right now. But
Yeah.
the sort of policies that it's sort of journalism versus history.
Yeah.
If you want to do the thing that looks great in the papers today, it might not be what winds up in the history books as the
Yeah.
greatest thing to have done at the time.
And what we see is the same sort of uh, artificial stimulation of the economy that we saw prior to the 2008 housing collapse. Is you have the Federal Reserve buying all these government bonds, pumping money into the economy, keeping credit easy to get, keeping interest rates low. Uh, and what this is doing, this is artificially, beyond what the market would do on its own, artificially boosting these financial indexes. It's artificially boosting what people are investing because they have all this money all of a sudden. But at the same time, as you pointed out, there's inflation. You have people's savings being sapped as a result of inflation. And I think the actual real growth rate of the economy or the GDP at the moment is about uh, 2% or something, which is not at all what say these financial indexes have grown over the same period. They've grown by considerably larger
Right.
amounts than the actual economic output. So these haven't been they've been outstripping it. So you've seen a sort of investment bubble. I don't know in what industry. I don't know where it's going to be, but yeah, you have Jerome Brook and several other very intelligent people saying the next collapse is yet to come. And in many ways, student debt is a big target because they're saying we get all these student loans and people may not be able to pay them back, especially when they're subsidized by the federal government, being subsidized by uh, most directly by the Federal Reserve, buying all the government debt to fund these loans, which students may not be able to pay back.
Right. Well, let's talk about because that's a good point. We have there's a strong legacy of really horribly failed economic policies in this administration. I was thinking about that this week.
Yeah.
That we've seen, I mean, when you look back on the and what prompted me to think of it was Fox did a sort of a remembering Cash for Clunkers special, which I don't know what exactly provoked it, but I wish it would play, I wish it would play once a week
Yeah,
because
yeah.
because really there are so many things we should remember over the course of the last 5 years. There was Cash for Clunkers, which I think cost about $10 million more than it ever made, which in the course of things, I mean, I think it cost them in the $30 million, $35 million range to execute, and it made about 25. And and I'm just trying to remember this off the top of my head. If I'm not quoting exact
Was
numbers.
that before or
but
after we bailed out Detroit? Not
that
the
was
city, but
that was after.
okay.
Yeah, but it was hailed as a victory by the
Yeah.
Obama administration. I remember Robert Gibb. Someone asked him, well, if it costs more than it made, how is it a success? And he said, well, you know what? I'm not an economist.
Obviously.
And I love Robert Gibb for all of the things that he's not.
Oh, he was snarky.
was
Yeah.
great at saying, well, you know what? I'm not an economist. Well, you know what? I'm not a math teacher. I always think he had some deep down childhood dream to be something else.
Yeah.
He didn't want to be a press secretary.
Became press
And
secretary.
he's bitter that he wasn't any of those things. But
He came out actually recently blasting the Obama administration for the Obamacare rollout, saying how embarrassing it's been for the administration. Just all this, the failed policies of not necessarily Obama. Well, obviously it will be Obamacare itself, but the rollout, the implementation, and especially the notion of saying, "Oh, you can keep your insurance if you like it."
well, I mean, he looked like a man in pain. He looked like someone
Yeah.
he looked like the condition he was in. He looked like a man whose whole job was to spin dirt. I
Yeah.
mean, to spin something that that simply wasn't there. Selling snake oil. And so it's not. I mean, I don't approve of what of him or of Jay Carney in their roles. I think that but I think that the sort of inflamed, bad moments that we've seen of them at the pulpit have been primarily the result of the fact that no one could do that job
No.
well. You can't spin something that isn't there.
No, because they've had to do it on so many policies within the Obama administration. Obviously, Obamacare is the biggest one in the news at the moment. Cash for Clunkers was another one. All the bailouts, failed tax policies, environmental policies, a whole bunch, just a whole slew of the administration's policy agenda as it relates to the economy has not been successful.
Well, and hitting on the environmental policy note, because I do want to get to that
Yeah.
in our last few minutes here. Um, I mean, President Obama, as of this week, issued what was hailed as a sweeping executive order establishing a new, I don't know whether to call it a bureaucracy, but essentially a system, but of consultation, I guess, between the federal government and various primarily Democratic governors, mayors,
Yeah.
State and local officials, and so forth, for the purpose of well, it was I mean, so
It was the idea of making the country what they called more resilient to climate change.
more resilient to climate
Yeah.
change, right? And essentially, what this does is it merges his, what's always been his prioritization of an environmentalist agenda over our economic well-being
Yeah.
with the sort of, what he called in I think 2010 and 11 shovel-ready jobs.
Yeah.
And well, actually, he's been calling it that since I think 2008.
I believe so.
Shovel-ready jobs that now no one talks about anymore because they never actually came.
Yeah.
And his program to energize the economy through infrastructure building, which to me always seemed like just such a dead end,
Yeah.
avenue for stimulus. But for some reason, I think they liked the Great Depression, New Deal sort of imagery that it evoked.
Which obviously worked so well the first time around.
Right.
It's the idea you're looking to build infrastructure where there may not actually be a need. You're building these you're building these bridges, producing temporary jobs, and there may have actually been no economic necessity for it. And you think, okay, infrastructure in the end does stimulate the economy insofar as commerce relies on decent infrastructure. But if you're just building the bridges just to produce jobs, that is not the best way to allocate funds, let alone for the government. The government shouldn't be involved in it at all. But the idea of allocating economic assets to dead-end projects is just contrary to economic growth.
Yeah, and the gross value of infrastructure projects, that are demanded in the United States right now, it's considerable when you compare it to other nations. Of course, we're a much larger nation.
Yeah.
But really, when it comes to energizing the economy as a whole, I mean, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's rather absurd to assume that, when you look at these numbers, to assume that it will have any significant effect on the trajectory of the economy overall, particularly when that's pitted against, Obamacare and Federal Reserve policies and so forth. And, we made a comment in I believe it was the 2012 year in review in the Mendenhall. And it was something to the effect that, could the next year be the sort of 1937 all over again? Which, for those not up on their Great Depression history, 1937 was essentially when many of the policies that the Roosevelt administration had pursued, fiscal policies, supposedly job-creating policies and so forth, came into effect, and what they thought would be a great economic stimulus actually turned around what had been, an economy on an uphill slope.
A moderately uphill slope.
Moderately uphill slope, but it had been recovering, and that's what, when they refer to the Great Depression as a double dip depression, a double dip recession, it's been debated whether or not this recession would ever become that, but certainly it's flirted with it.
Yeah,
and I think if anything could really rock the boat and put us over that tipping point, it's this Obamacare program really being brought out in full force, and Americans being able to see what it actually does.
And I think that even the administration is aware of it, because that's why you have all these one-year delays for the biggest employers of the country, out of fear that they're going to cut employment, or they're also going to cut hours.
He came out and apologized this week.
Did he? I didn't hear about that.
Oh yeah, I think it was yesterday or the day before. The president came out and actually apologized that so many people were losing their health insurance.
Oh, okay. Well, I saw Obama is sorry trending on Twitter, but I didn't know what it was about.
Which was nice of him. I just wish that he hadn't spent the last 4 years crusading for the very things that he's now giving us a pat on the back and an apology and I didn't know, no one could have known beforehand kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's just, it just seems like so little, so late. But back to the point of the environmentalist agenda, because there were some interesting juxtapositions of news stories in the last week.
Yeah.
you had this executive order that was this sweeping new program for involving state and local governments with
pretty much the whole cabinet.
Yeah, you have everything from Homeland Security to Defense, Energy to Department of Defense and Labor and
Housing and Urban Development.
Everyone, getting roped into this. What's essentially yet again one more nod by the Obama administration to the environmentalist groups, to whom they seem so indebted. And it's interesting that, I don't know that I've seen the Obama administration kowtow so meekly, so diffidently to any group, even to labor unions, who effectively wrote the Obamacare legislation. I mean,
And,
it,
yeah, and
it
many
was
are against
largely
it. Yeah,
largely outsourced to them, and he's now turned his back on them, for the sake of preserving the healthcare bill. But
yeah,
but the one group, interestingly, that he's not willing to turn his back on, not willing to even for a moment displease,
yeah,
are the the environmentalist nihilist far left.
yeah. And that's why we discussed the Keystone Pipeline in the last podcast. Why he's not either approved or denied it. It's just kind of sat in purgatory because I'm pretty sure he's well aware that if he denies it, it means denying jobs to the American people. It means denying a flow of petroleum oil to the United States from Canada, and he doesn't want that on his record. But at the same time, he doesn't want to approve it because he doesn't want to anger those same groups that you were just mentioning.
Right, and meanwhile, I think this is interesting. It's an article by, it's published through the Cato Institute, Cato at Liberty, and it's by Chip Knappenberger and Patrick Michaels. And the headline says everything that you could need it to. It says observations now inconsistent with climate model predictions for 25 going on 35 years, and it's about the legacy of failed environmentalist claims and failed climate projections. And I think what's interesting is that there's an industry that's developed around this. There is an industry of sort of an academic culture of climate model building and catastrophe predictions that get people published, and it gets them on the IPCC,
And it gets them grants.
and it gets them grants, exactly. But it's an issue that has been so built up and around which so much funding has been built that it's against their economic interest
Yeah.
to ever say otherwise. So it ceases to be valid science. It ceases to be the pursuit of knowledge,
Yeah.
and starts to be the pursuit of funding.
Yeah.
In which knowledge is sort of a tool. It's incidental.
And that's what happens in any case when government gets involved in science. One of the things involved with the executive order was the establishment of some website called data.gov, which was meant to share, collect, and develop data uh, about climate change issues. So, meaning that if your data is not on that website, it's not likely to matter because people are going to say, "Oh, well, the government didn't approve it. The government doesn't see any use for it. Therefore, your data is not approved." Same with the IPCC and International Panel on Climate Change in the UN. But once you really start looking at some of the science behind it, as you and I have, just to use an example, Capitalist Solutions by Andrew Bernstein. Great book for anyone who wants to read it. But in his chapter on climate change, he notes a statement by Fred Singer, a climatologist, who says that, quote, CO2 levels were 10 times higher than today's during the frigid Ordovician glacial period about 440 million years ago. And another one, a paleoclimatologist, Dr. Tim Patterson, says, quote, there is no meaningful correlation between CO2 levels and the Earth's temperature over this geologic time frame.
Right, and essentially what we have now is data confirming just as much. We are as developed and industrial a world as we have ever been. I will note that really since the industrial era, it's actually been technological innovation and progress that's led to a decline in hazardous emissions and pollution and so forth.
Absolutely.
So that's one thing worth noting. But technologically we're as advanced as we've ever been, and current models show that over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, the projections and the models that climatologists have put forward have been consistently proven wrong. That you've had overall a rather flat line graph, demonstrating global temperatures. And in fact, if there's any inclination for this flat line to turn one way or the other, it's turned down. And we've actually had, a very slight level of cooling over the course of the last 10 or 15 years worldwide. But and in fact, in a Senate committee, and I don't remember when exactly it was, but it was just in the last couple of months, you had scientists brought before a Senate committee in which a Democrat had sort of convened them in hopes that these climate scientists would confirm would essentially affirm the Obama administration's policies and environmentalist agenda and the left's, laws, bills to that effect.
Right.
And so this scientist was brought forward, and the senator asks him, so, don't your findings substantiate these sorts of policy maneuvers and that CO2 emissions have led to an overall warming of the temperature over the last 10 to 15 years? Hasn't the Earth gotten warmer? And he flat out says, actually, no, sorry.
I see you have the computer models, which they put in a few numbers of a few selected years, and it spits out a prediction of continuing that trend. But of course, we know that trends don't just continue literally.
Well, and the model only, a computer model will only show you what you put into it.
Yeah, exactly.
And the entry data can be manipulated to no end to generate, the sort of results that you want to find.
Yeah,
essentially. So I just think that this has become politics in disguise as science.
Yeah, and just as a closing, because I think we're wrapping it up here soon.
Yeah.
Many people assume that you say I'm not for environmentalism. I'm not for environmentalist policies. That means you just hate nature and you would prefer just polluting everything.
Devastation.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Well, what do you say to that? Is there? We like to use the word conservationism for certain policies. What would you say to the distinction between environmentalism and conservationism would be?
Well, I think that conservationism isn't unfortunately a term that is used very much anymore. It was sort of edged out over time throughout the 20th century, particularly since the
conflated
1960s
with
70s,
environmentalism.
and conflated with environmentalism. But conservationism originally, in the sort of classic Teddy Roosevelt sense of the word, was about preserving nature for the benefit of man. And I think that's the real distinction between the way that these issues used to be addressed in earlier generations and the way that they're addressed today by environmentalists. And I'm not talking about the person protesting and waving signs for Greenpeace outside of an oil rig or something.
Wearing polar bear costumes.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm not talking about those people because personally, I think Alex Epstein's pretty consistently demonstrated that they're not even always all that well informed about the issues that
tend to not be
that they're protesting. Right. But I'm talking about the intellectual leadership, the people who set the tone of a movement like that.
Yeah.
And among them, you have people who have shown themselves to not be interested in the benefit to human beings.
Yeah.
And in fact, rather inimical to the benefit, to human beings' benefit. There's an interesting quote here. David Graeber, who is a biologist with the National Park Service. I'm drawing this, by the way, from an article or an essay, "The Philosophy of Privation: Environmentalism Unveiled" by Peter Schwartz, which is a great resource. It's a bit dated. It was from years ago, I believe, mid to mid 90s, but it's nonetheless very revelatory. But David Graeber from the National Park Service, a biologist, once wrote that he describes himself as among those who, quote, value wilderness for its own sake, not for what value it confers upon mankind. We are not interested in the utility of a particular species or free-flowing river or ecosystem to mankind. They have intrinsic value, more value to me than another human body or a billion of them.
Yeah. End quote. Have you ever heard of Aldo Leopold? Land ethic?
No.
He's one of, I would say he would be like one of the philosophical forefathers of that idea.
Well, and it has, it's shown political consequence. It's shown, sort of dispersion throughout the culture, both here in the United States and abroad. The Green Party of Germany says, one of their spokesmen was quoted as saying, quote, "We in the Green Movement aspire to a cultural model in which the killing of a forest will be considered more contemptible and more criminal than the sale of 6-year-old children to Asian brothels." And Al Gore, in his book Earth in the Balance, writes, "It seems an easy choice. Sacrifice a tree for a human life until one learns that 3 trees must be destroyed for each patient treated." Speaking of, Taxol, right?
Yeah.
And then he says, "Suddenly we realize we must confront some tough questions."
Oh yeah.
So Al Gore,
a human life is not worth 3 trees.
Yeah, former Vice President of the United States, very nearly President of the United States. In fact, by the popular vote, he simply was elected President of the United States. And Al Gore has difficulty deciding between cutting down 3 trees and saving a human life. And I think that says so much about the sort of nihilistic, anti-human thinking that operates at an intellectual level in the upper echelons of the environmentalist movement. And
Absolutely.
I think that is the sort of intellectual pressure that seems to have shown itself as having real force inside the Obama administration in motivating its policies to the detriment of our economy in general. And I think that what you've seen over the last 5 years is the conflicting interests between the Obama administration and the American people at large. And whether it's on environmental policy, whether it's on healthcare policy, whatever it may be, the interests of the administration in pursuing its policy goals, saying that it achieved something simply because it was able to pass something into law, because it was able to bring it into effect, regardless of the effect that those policies would then have on the American people and on our economy, on the job market, on on our physical health, on our overall well-being. And I think that sort of pragmatic, we did something, we gave you something, whether or not it was good or bad, becomes a cheap but widely accepted standard. And it's been an open door, for an administration that has consistently pursued goals that are so inimical to the well-being of the American citizenry at large, that I think it's fair to say that in most cases, when the Obama administration has won, the American people have lost.
Absolutely.
And nothing could be more of a crowning statement to that effect than Obamacare as it's coming into effect. And what the Obama administration hailed as its biggest legislative triumph. Obama has tied himself to it as his legacy, ultimately accepting even the term Obamacare rather than insisting on it being called the Affordable Care Act. But
it'll be hard to push that name as time goes on.
but even he has come to say, yes, it is Obamacare. I did that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thinking that it would work, but now that it hasn't, and now that now that we're really starting to see what's behind the veil, I think it'll be interesting to see going forward whether people wake up to recognizing the sort of fundamental conflict of interest that is going on between the administration and the American people at large. The fact that when the White House succeeds, we all seem to lose economically, in terms of our physical health, in terms of our career prospects,
retirement
prospects, and all of that resonates in a million life decisions that we can't even be fully cognizant of in our own lives.
Right.
So I think that is the sum message to take away from all the things that we've discussed today is the fundamentally contradictory and inimical relationship between the policies of this administration and the American people at large.
I agree. I have nothing to add except for one point. Just going back to it, because it's been sticking in my mind this whole time. When we talked about Teddy Roosevelt and agreeing with him on the idea that nature has some value to man, doesn't mean we want to put it in state control. Because if it has value, it will be pursued. And that's how the market works. We don't believe the state needs to run national parks. I enjoy national parks, I have to admit. But I don't think it's a state policy that needs to be pursued.
Right. Well, I think that fortunately, a lot of the things that we've discussed today are being reflected in poll numbers.
Yes.
We're starting to see. Do you have those?
Yes. The Politico was reporting on some of Obama's recent poll numbers from the Pew Research Center and found that he has a 12-point deficit in approval, which is, according to the article, the largest in Obama's presidency.
All right. Well, hopefully that counts for something. I mean, unfortunately, the man's not up for re-election, so effectively, hopefully it just resonates in the 2014 midterm elections, because hopefully people will recognize that this is a Democratic Party today that
it's enabling him.
Well, and it's so towing the line.
Yeah,
you have so few among them. I mean, look, before the budget battle and after the budget battle, how many Democrats came out and said, well, I'd actually be up for delaying Obamacare. I just wasn't willing to say it 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, and it's I think that'll be an interesting subject for another podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why exactly? Because there are fundamental philosophical reasons why the Democrats, why those in the Democratic Party have been so unable to deviate from the party line, why they've been so married to the White House, and
Right.
and so willing to toe the line on all of its policies, why they've been unable to create an equivalent to the Tea Party as they tried to do with Occupy Wall Street.
Well, that was a little bit further
and
left,
yeah,
even more than what they're. And the problem is they're so far left that it's hard to produce anything even further in that direction without being blatantly honest
right.
about their intentions.
Well, and so that's an interesting discussion that I think we should come back to in the next podcast.
Absolutely.
So let's look forward to that. But for today, I believe that's all the time
Yes,
that we
it
have,
is.
unfortunately. But it has been fun, as always. We've addressed a number of very important and very interesting topics as they're rapidly developing. And if they develop, well, hopefully they won't be developing the same direction. But
Except for the poll numbers.
Except for the poll numbers, exactly. But we will be covering them, no doubt, in years to come. So thank you for joining us on the Mendenhall Podcast. I'm Slade Mendenhall.
I'm Brian Underwood.
And we'll see you next time.